Before we begin, if you believe that the good you put into the world, quietly expecting nothing back, is never really lost, that it goes somewhere and waits, this story is going to prove it to you. So hit subscribe right now, because the man in this story spent 15 years fixing cars for free for people who couldn't pay and told no one. And the day his own daughter's life came down to money he did not have, he found out where all that good had been waiting the whole time. Calvin Reeves owned an auto shop called Reeves and Daughter, and the "and Daughter" was painted on the sign in careful hand lettering before the daughter in question was even old enough to hold a wrench, because Calvin had put it there. The week Grace was born, a promise made to a sleeping newborn that she would always, no matter what, have a place in the world with her own name already waiting on it. The shop was 2 bays in a working part of town, nothing fancy, a hand-painted sign and a waiting room with a coffee maker that had been broken for so long it was basically furniture, though. Calvin fixed it finally the week Grace came home, because Grace said a place where people wait for good news should have working coffee, and he could not argue with that, and a wall of photographs. And I will tell you about the wall of photographs, because the wall is the whole story before the story even starts. Calvin was a big man with careful hands and a quiet way about him, 44 years old, and he had been fixing cars in that town for over 20 years, the last 15 of them in his own 2 bays. He was, by the measure of any business school, a terrible businessman, and by the measure of the town, he was something closer to a saint, though he would have been embarrassed by the word and would have wiped his hands on a rag and changed the subject. Because here is what Calvin Reeves did quietly for 15 years. When a single mother came in with a car that would not start and a face that told him she was choosing this month between the repair and the groceries, Calvin fixed the car and told her it was a loose connection, no charge, when it was in fact a $400 alternator that he paid for out of his own pocket. When a kid working 2 jobs to stay in school came in with brakes worn down to nothing and $80 to his name, Calvin did the brakes and took the 80 and pretended 80 was the price. When an old man on a fixed income needed his only car to pass inspection to keep his independence, Calvin found a way, always found a way, and the way more often than the town ever knew was Calvin's own money and Calvin's own time given after hours in the second bay to people who could not pay and would never be asked to. And every one of them, every single person, Calvin quietly carried. He took a photograph of standing next to their fixed car, smiling, and he pinned it to the wall of the waiting room, not to keep score. Calvin did not think of it as score. He thought of it as the opposite of score. He thought of it as a reminder on the hard days of why the shop existed, because the shop did not exist to make Calvin rich. It existed, he would tell Grace, to be the place in town where your car trouble was not also the end of your world. The wall filled up over 15 years, hundreds of faces, hundreds of people whose worst day Calvin had quietly turned into a manageable one, and then sent them off, never mentioning what it had really cost, letting them keep the dignity of believing they had paid a fair price for an honest fix. Grace had grown up under that wall, and she used to make her father tell the stories, would point at a photograph and say, "That one," and Calvin would tell her carefully only the parts that did not embarrass anyone. "That's Miss Rosa. Her car had a poorly transmission. We sorted it out." Never the true cost, never the weekend of his own labor, never the parts he paid for. And Grace grew up thinking of the wall as a kind of picture book of her father's whole life, which is exactly what it was. She simply did not know yet that it was written in a currency she could not see. The town knew Calvin was good. The town did not know how good, because Calvin had spent 15 years making sure the true price of his goodness stayed a secret, on the theory, which was his father's theory, that a kindness announced is a kindness half taken back. Calvin came by the second bay honestly, because his own father, a mechanic named Otis Reeves, had run a shop the same way in the same town a generation earlier, and Calvin had grown up watching Otis do the exact things Calvin would later do: fix the car and shave the bill and send a struggling family off with their dignity intact and young. Calvin had once asked his father why he did it, why he gave away money. They did not exactly have to spare, and Otis had wiped his hands on a rag, the gesture Calvin would inherit along with everything else, and said, "Son, a car in this town isn't a luxury. A car is a job you can get to and a hospital you can reach and a kid you can pick up from school. When I fix a man's car for what he can pay instead of what it costs, I'm not fixing a car. I'm keeping a whole life from coming apart at the one loose bolt he couldn't afford to tighten. That's not charity. That's just seeing the whole machine instead of the one part." And Otis had taught Calvin to see the whole machine, the life around the car, and it had made Calvin a poor businessman and a wealthy man. And Calvin had never once, not for a single day, wished his father had taught him differently, even in the dark at the kitchen table with the impossible number in front of him, because a man does not regret the thing that made him who he is, even when who he is cannot save the person he loves most. Grace was 13, and Grace was the sun the whole shop rotated around. Her mother, Calvin's wife, Simone, had died when Grace was 8, and here is the thing that gives this story its particular weight. Simone had died of a heart condition, a congenital thing, a weakness in the machinery of the heart that had gone undiagnosed until it was too late to fix. And Calvin had spent the years since, as both father and mother, to a little girl who was the image of the woman he had lost and who carried, though they did not know it for certain, yet the possibility of the same weakness in her own chest. They watched it. There were cardiologists and checkups, and a careful, hopeful monitoring, and for years Grace was fine, was better than fine, was a loud, funny, brilliant kid who hung around the shop after school and could by the age of 11 correctly diagnose a bad wheel bearing by sound alone, and who intended, she announced regularly, to take over the daughter part of the sign the second she was legally allowed to hold a job. Simone's death had rearranged Calvin in a way that he had never fully spoken about, even to Grace, and it is worth pausing on because it is the reason the number in the dark hit him the way it did. Simone had died of the heart condition, yes, but the part Calvin carried in silence was that in her case there had been a chance, a slim one, a specialist and a procedure, and it had cost money they did not have, and by the time Calvin had scraped and borrowed and figured out a way to find it, the way he always found a way, it had been too late. Her heart had gone before the money came together. Calvin had never told anyone that. He had never told Grace that her mother might have lived if the money had come faster. He carried it alone, the specific and unbearable knowledge that in the one instance where finding a way mattered most, he had found it a few weeks too slow, and that a man who spent his life keeping other families' lives from coming apart at the one loose bolt had watched his own wife's life come apart at exactly such a bolt for want of money arriving in time. So when the cardiologist said the word expensive about Grace, Calvin did not just hear a number. He heard Simone, he heard the clock, he heard the few weeks too slow, and the terror that put his head down on the kitchen table was not only that he might lose Grace, it was that he might lose her, the identical way to money that came together a little too late, and that he could not survive, being that slow, twice could not survive, it would not. And then the spring, Grace turned 13, the thing they had been watching for arrived. You have to understand what Grace was to that shop and what the shop was to Grace, because it makes what came later land the way it should. Grace had grown up on a creeper board, rolling under cars on the smell of oil and the sound of the impact, wrench on doing her homework on the workbench while her father worked, and she had turned the shop into her own kingdom, had named all the loaner cars, had a stool with her name on it, had learned to run the register and count back change, and crucially had absorbed the second bay without anyone explaining it, had simply understood from watching that sometimes her daddy fixed a car and the person cried and hugged him, and there was no money involved, and that this was normal, and that this was in fact the best part. One evening when Grace was about 11, she had asked Calvin why he never seemed to charge the people who cried, and Calvin had given her his father's answer, the whole machine, the loose bolt, the life around the car. And Grace had thought about it, and then she had said in the devastating direct way of children, "So when someone can't pay, that's when it matters the most that you're good at it." And Calvin had had to turn around and pretend to look for a socket, because his 11-year-old had just said the truest sentence anyone had ever said about his life's work, and he did not want her to see what it did to his face. That was Grace. That was the girl whose heart was now failing the same way her mother's had. It came the way it had come for her mother, quietly at first, and then not quietly at all, a fainting spell at school, and then tests, and then the appointment where a cardiologist sat across from Calvin Reeves and used the careful, slow voice and told him that Grace had the same condition that had taken Simone, that it was progressing, that it was serious, and that there was, unlike in her mother's day, something that could be done, a surgery, a specialized and complex and enormously expensive surgery performed by one of the few teams in the country who did it well, a surgery that could give Grace a full, long, ordinary life. And Calvin's heart leapt at the word surgery and then fell straight through the floor at the word expensive, because Calvin Reeves, who had given away his own money for 15 years to keep other people's worlds from ending, did not have the money to keep his own from ending, and his insurance. The cheap, catastrophic plan that was all a two-bay shop owner could afford, covered a fraction, and the fraction left a number behind it that Calvin could not have paid if he sold the shop, the house, the tools, and everything he had ever owned twice over. He got the number and he went home, and after Grace was asleep he sat in the dark at the kitchen table, the same way every one of these men sits in the dark at a kitchen table, and Calvin Reeves, who had never in his life felt sorry for himself, who had given and never once counted, put his head down on the table and wept because he had spent his whole life being the man who found a way, and for the first time there was no way to find, and the person the way was for was the only person left in the world who carried Simone's face, and he could not save her. And the machine had a price, and he did not have it, and there was not enough goodness in his own two hands to close the gap. Here is what Calvin did not know sitting in the dark. He did not know about the wall. Or rather, he knew about the wall, he had built the wall, but he did not understand what the wall was, because Calvin genuinely all the way down did not keep score, and so he had never once done the thing you or I might have done, which is to look at a wall of hundreds of people you have quietly saved and think someday, if I ever need it, that wall owes me. Calvin had never thought it. The wall to him was a reminder of purpose, not a ledger of debt. And so it did not occur to Calvin Reeves in his darkest hour that he was in fact one of the richest men in that town, that he had spent 15 years making deposits into a bank that does not appear on any statement, in the bank of people whose worst day you quietly carried, and that the balance in that account was about to astonish him. Let me tell you about 3 of the faces on that wall, so the wall is not just a number to you the way it was never just a number to Calvin. There was a woman named Rosa, a home health aide, who had come in years earlier with a transmission on its last legs and 3 kids in the back seat and a face doing math, and Calvin had rebuilt that transmission over a weekend and charged her for a fluid change. And Rosa had driven that car another 6 years and never known, and used it to get to the houses of the elderly people she kept alive, so that Calvin, in a way, had been quietly keeping a dozen old people company through Rosa without any of them ever knowing his name. There was a veteran named Hollis who had come back from a war with his hands not quite steady and could no longer do his own repairs, a proud man for whom accepting help was a wound, and Calvin had learned to help him in a way that let him keep his pride, would let Hollis stand in the bay and hand him tools and call it supervising and charge him a consulting discount that was in fact most of the bill. And Hollis had wept the day he figured it out, years later, and had never spoken of it, and had put Calvin's name in his will for a small amount he could not really spare, which Calvin did not know about. And there was the kid, the one with the brakes and the $80, whose name was Marcus, and who is where this next part starts, because Marcus, of all the hundreds on that wall, was the one who was paying the closest attention of all. It started as these things so often start with a kid. A young man named Marcus, no relation to anyone who is now 26 and an EMT, and who had been the kid with the worn-out brakes and the $80. 9 years earlier, the one Calvin had done the brakes for and pretended 80 was the price. Marcus had figured it out, years later had done the math on what those brakes actually cost, had understood what Calvin had done, and had never forgotten it, and Marcus was the one who happened to be working the day Grace was brought into the hospital after the fainting spell, and Marcus, who paid attention, who had become the kind of person who pays attention, because a mechanic had once shown him that paying attention to people was a thing. Men did. Put it together. The name Reeves, the girl, the shop, and Marcus found out what was happening, and Marcus found out about the number, and Marcus did the thing that changed everything, which was that he refused to let it stay a secret, the way Calvin had kept all his own kindnesses secret. You have to appreciate the exact size of what Marcus decided to do, because it went directly against the deepest rule of the man he was trying to help. Calvin's entire practice, inherited from Otis, was built on secrecy, on never letting the carried person know the true cost. On the theory that a kindness announced is a kindness half taken back. Marcus was about to announce 15 years of the most carefully kept kindnesses in that town's history publicly to everyone. He knew Calvin would hate it. He knew Calvin, if asked, would forbid. It would rather lose the shop and maybe lose Grace than have the town told what he had really been doing all those years, because being publicly revealed as that generous felt to a man like Calvin almost like bragging, like taking back the gift. And Marcus decided to do it anyway, decided that Calvin's pride was the one thing in this situation that did not get a vote, because a little girl's life outweighed a good man's discomfort at being seen. and because Marcus had learned from Calvin himself that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to let them carry a thing alone, even when their whole identity is built on carrying things alone. It was, in a way, Marcus giving Calvin his own medicine, and it took real courage, because Marcus was not sure Calvin would ever forgive him for exposing the secret. Calvin did forgive him. It took Calvin a while, but he forgave him because grace lived and because a man cannot stay angry forever at the person who refused to let him be too proud to save his own daughter. Marcus went to the wall. I went to the shop and he stood in the waiting room in front of the wall of photographs, hundreds of them, 15 years of them, and he started taking pictures of the pictures, and he started making calls, and he started finding people, the single mother with the alternator now years on and back on her feet, the old man with the inspection, the dozens and dozens of people whose worst day Calvin Reeves had quietly turned into a manageable one, and Marcus told each of them the same thing he said. You remember Calvin fixed your car when you couldn't pay. I need to tell you something. It cost him more than he ever let you know. He's been carrying this whole town out of his own pocket for 15 years and never said a word. And now his little girl is sick and there's a surgery that can save her, and Calvin can't find the way this time, and I think it's time this town found it for him. And the town did the thing that Calvin had spent 15 years teaching it, without either of them realizing he was teaching it how to do. The town showed up. It did not happen the way a movie would do it all at once in a single triumphant scene. It happened the way real community happens, in 100 small acts that accumulated into something none of them could have managed alone. The single mother with the alternator organized a fundraiser at the church. The old man with the inspection, who turned out to have a nephew at the local news station, got the story on the air. Not the story Calvin would have told, but the true one, the one about the wall, about the 15 years, about the man who had quietly kept a whole town's cars running and a whole town's worlds from ending and had never once mentioned the cost. Marcus set up the online fund and put a photograph of the wall at the top of it, and the photograph of that wall, hundreds of faces of people one man had quietly saved, did something to everyone who saw it, because it was the most concrete possible proof of a truth. People desperately want to believe and rarely get to see demonstrated that goodness is real, that it accumulates, that a man can spend 15 years putting good into the world with no expectation of return, and that the good does not vanish. It waits pinned to a wall until the day it is needed. The news segment was the thing that broke it open beyond the town, and it was not the story anyone would have scripted. The reporter, the old man's nephew, did not lead with the sick little girl. Though he could have the sick little girl is the easy story. He led with the wall. He stood in the waiting room in front of it, and he panned across hundreds of faces, and he said, every person in these photographs had their worst day, quietly turned around by the man who owns this shop, and not one of them was ever told what it really cost him. He has been secretly carrying this town for 15 years. And now his daughter is dying, and for the first time in his life he can't find the way, so the town is going to find it for him. And then he did something that undid everyone watching. Holly interviewed the people from the wall one after another, and each one told their small story. The transmission, the inspection, the brakes, and each one ended unprompted with almost the same sentence, I didn't know until years later what he really did for me. And by the fourth or fifth person saying it, the pattern itself became the story. The sheer accumulated weight of a man's hidden goodness, and people who had never met Calvin Reeves and lived nowhere near that town watched a stranger's 15 years of quiet mercy laid out face by face, and gave because the wall gave them something they were starving for, proof that this kind of man exists. Rosa, the home health aide, gave a day's pay and got every one of her elderly clients and their families to give too. Hollis, the veteran who could not spare it, gave anyway, and it came out at the same time quietly that Hollis had, years earlier, put Calvin in his will, and Hollis stood in front of the reporter and said, I'm not dead yet, so I changed it. I gave it to the girl now while it can still fix a heart instead of buy a headstone. That's what Calvin would do. He'd rather the money came in time. And that sentence, they'd rather the money came in time, hit Calvin in a place no one watching could have understood, because no one watching knew about Simone, about the few weeks too slow. And Calvin heard an old veteran he had carried it say the exact thing that Calvin's whole life had been organized around and haunted by, and Calvin had to leave the room. The fund did not just meet the number, it buried the number. It buried it so completely, so quickly, that Calvin Reeves, who had not asked for a cent, who had not even known Marcus was doing any of it, got a phone call from the fundraiser telling him the total, and Calvin had to sit down on the floor of his own shop in front of his own wall, and he could not speak because the number that had broken him in the dark at his kitchen table, the impossible number, the number that stood between his daughter and a full, long, ordinary life, had been erased by the very people he had spent 15 years refusing to let pay him, and Calvin understood sitting on the floor that he had been rich the entire time and had never known it, that the wall he thought was a reminder of purpose had also been all along without his ever intending it. The most secure retirement account any man ever built, denominated not in dollars, but in the one currency that actually pays out when everything else fails, which is the good you did for people when you thought no one was counting. When the woman running the fundraiser told him the total on the phone, Calvin actually asked her to repeat it twice because his mind could not hold the number. It was so far past the impossible number that had broken him, and then there was a long silence on the line, and the woman, who had herself been carried by Calvin years before, said gently, "Calvin, do you understand what this is? This is 15 years coming home. This is every single person you ever helped all at once saying thank you the only way big enough. You never let us pay you. So we saved it up. This is the bill, Calvin. This is us finally getting to pay the bill." And Calvin Reeves sat down on the floor of his own shop under his own wall, and he could not answer her, and she stayed on the line and listened to a strong man cry, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed saying. The day of the surgery, the hospital waiting room could not hold the people who came. That is not an exaggeration, and it is the detail Calvin returns to most often. He had braced himself to sit in that room alone, the way he had sat alone at the kitchen table, the way he had sat alone through Simone, because Calvin's whole life had trained him to carry the heaviest things by himself. And instead, the room filled, and then the hallway filled. Rosa and Hollis and Marcus and the single mother and the old man and dozens more faces from the wall. People who had cleared their day to sit in a hospital for a girl. Most of them had only met as a kid running the register at Reeves and Daughter, and they did not make speeches and they did not crowd him. They just were there, a wall of people, a living version of the wall in the shop. And Calvin sat in the middle of it during the longest hours of his life, and he was not alone. And he wept quietly at one point, not out of fear, but out of the sheer unfamiliarity of being held, because a man who has spent his life being the one who shows up for everyone else does not know until it happens to him what it feels like to be the one everyone shows up for, and it undid Calvin more gently and more completely than any hardship ever had. Marcus the EMT sat beside him the whole time, and near the end of the wait, when Calvin's hands were shaking, Marcus said quietly, "You did my brakes when I had $80. You told me 80 was the price. I've known for 9 years it wasn't. I became an EMT because you showed me that paying attention to people was a thing men could do. So whatever happens in there, I need you to know your kindness has already been saving lives for 9 years through me, and it's going to keep doing it. You were never as alone as you thought, Calvin. None of us ever told you, but you were never alone." And then the surgeon came out, and the surgeon was smiling. Grace had the surgery. I'm not going to keep you in suspense about the thing that matters most, because Calvin would not want me to. The surgery worked. The specialized team, the expensive complex procedure, gave Grace exactly what the cardiologist had promised it could. Repaired heart, and the full, long, ordinary life that her mother had been born too early to be given. When Grace woke up from the anesthesia, groggy and small in the hospital bed, the first thing she said before she said anything about pain or fear was, "Did everybody come?" Because she had heard somehow, in the way kids always hear the things adults think they have hidden, that the town had shown up. And Calvin said, "Yes, baby. Everybody came. They're all in the hall." And Grace smiled with her eyes still closed and said, "We're going to need a bigger wall." And Calvin laughed for the first time in weeks, a real laugh. The laugh of a man whose daughter was going to live. Grace Reeves is going to grow up. She is going to take over the "and daughter" on the sign. She is going to be fine, because a town that a man had quietly carried for 15 years reached down all at once and carried him and his daughter right back. And that is not a fairy tale. That is just what happens when a good man's account finally comes due, and the miracle of it is not that it happened. The miracle is how common this kind of miracle actually is, and how rarely we get to see the whole shape of it laid out on a wall. And there is a resolution buried in the speed of it that only Calvin fully felt, and I have to name it because it is the deepest thing in this whole story. The money came in time. That is the sentence Calvin cannot say out loud without his voice going. With Simone, the way had been found a few weeks too slow, and Calvin had carried that few weeks like a stone in his chest for 5 years, the private conviction that he had failed the one time it mattered most. And with Grace, the money did not come a few weeks too slow. It came in a flood. Fast, faster than he could have found it alone in 10 lifetimes, so fast that the surgery was scheduled without a single day lost to fundraising, and somewhere in the middle of the terror, Calvin understood that the town had not just saved his daughter, the town had reached back through 5 years and unmade the thing that had been killing him, since Simone had proven to him that the way could come in time, that he had not been a failure with his wife, he had simply been one man against a clock, and that no man is enough against that clock alone, that it takes a wall, and that he had spent 15 years building exactly the wall that would finally for Grace beat the clock that had beaten him for Simone. The town gave Calvin his daughter's life. It also, without knowing it, gave him back the 5 years he had spent blaming himself for his wife's death. And Calvin has said that of the two gifts, he is not certain which one he could have lived longer without. But the part of the story I actually want to sit with you in is what happened after, because after is where the meaning lives. When Calvin was well enough in his own heart to speak about it, when Grace was home and recovering, and the terror had drained down into gratitude, Calvin did something. He did not know how to thank a whole town. There is no thank you card big enough for the thing that had been done for him. So he did the only thing he knew how to do, the thing his father had taught him, the thing he had done for 15 years. I went back to the shop and he opened the second bay, the after-hours bay, the free bay, and he kept it open. And he kept doing exactly what he had always done, kept quietly carrying the people who could not pay. Kept pretending the alternator was a loose connection, kept taking the $80 and calling it the price. Only now he did it openly. Now he let the town know what the second bay was for because the secret was out. The wall had been photographed, there was no more hiding it, and so Calvin turned the second bay into a thing. The whole town could feed a place where anyone who had ever been carried could come and carry someone else, and it grew, and it became in that town a kind of institution, the Reeves second bay, where your car trouble was not the end of your world. Staffed on weekends now by volunteers, by Marcus, the EMT, and the single mother, and the old man, and the kid with the brakes, all grown up. All of them showing up to be for the next person what Calvin had been for them. The first person, the openly known second bay carried after the whole town, found out what it was a young father named Terrell, new to town, who came in embarrassed and defensive with a car he could not afford to fix, and a baby seat in the back, braced for the humiliation he had learned to expect. And he found instead a shop where a 13-year-old girl walked him to a stool with her name on it and got him a coffee from a machine that finally worked, and a big quiet man fixed his car. And when Terrell went for a wallet that did not have enough in it, said the thing Otis had taught Calvin, and Calvin had taught the town, a car in this town isn't a luxury, son. Come back when you can, and when you can, you carry the next one. And Terrell asked what he meant, carry the next one, and Grace, ringing up a 0, pointed at the wall and said, that's the deal. He carries you, then someday, you carry somebody, and you get to go up there. And Terrell looked at the wall of hundreds of faces and understood that he had wandered into something that was not a business at all. It was a promise the town made to itself, running through a 2-bay garage, and he comes back every weekend now to volunteer, and his photograph is on the wall. And so is the photograph of the first person Terrell himself carried, because that is how the wall grows, that is how it has always grown. One carried person becoming a carrier. And the wall kept growing. It grows still. Grace adds to it now because Grace lived and Grace works the second bay, and every person she and her father carry gets their photograph pinned up next to the hundreds, already there, and Grace understands the wall in a way that her father in his beautiful refusal to keep score never quite let himself understand it, because Grace was there on the floor the day the number got buried. Grace saw what the wall paid out, and Grace will tell you 13, going on 30, that the wall is the truest thing she knows, that it is proof. Physical proof. You can stand in front of that. The good you do quietly is not lost, that it goes onto a wall, somewhere into an account you cannot see, and that it waits patiently for the exact day, your own worst day arrives, and then it pays all at once in the faces of everyone you ever helped when you thought no one was counting. There is a photograph on that wall now that is different from all the others, and it is the one Calvin looks at most. It is not a customer. It is a photograph of the town, hundreds of people crowded into the shop and spilling out into the lot. On the day Grace came home from the hospital, all of them there to welcome her, the single mother and the old man and Marcus and the kid with the brakes and dozens of faces from the wall. And in the center of it is Calvin Reeves holding his daughter. Both of them crying, surrounded, held, carried, and someone had made a sign, a hand-painted sign in the same style as the one over the shop, and it did not say Reeves and daughter. It said something else. It said, "The whole town is the daughter now," which did not quite make grammatical sense and made perfect sense anyway. And Calvin keeps that photograph at the center of the wall of everyone he ever carried, because it is the day the wall carried him. And he wants to look at it every single day for the rest of his life so that he never forgets the thing it cost him, nearly losing Grace, to finally learn, which is that the good you give away is the only thing you truly get to keep. There is a small scene from Grace's recovery that Calvin holds close. A few days after she came home still weak, she asked him to carry her stool from the shop into her bedroom, the one with her name on it, and he did, and she sat on it by her window, and she said, "Daddy, when I take over the and-daughter part, I want to keep the wall going forever. Even when it's full, we'll get another wall. We'll fill the whole building." And Calvin said, "Okay." And Grace said, "Because that's what saved me, right? Not the money, the wall. The money was just the wall paying out." And Calvin, who had spent his whole life not keeping score, who had genuinely never understood the wall as anything but a reminder, looked at his 13-year-old who had understood in one near-death spring what had taken him 44 years and almost losing her to see, and he said, "Yeah, baby, the wall paid out. It always does. Your grandpa knew it. I forgot it. You're not going to forget it." And Grace said, "I'm not going to forget it." And she has not, and she will not, and that, more than the repaired heart, is the thing her father is most certain will outlive him. So here is what I want to leave you with tonight, and it is very simple, and Calvin would want it said plainly. You are building a wall right now, whether you know it or not. Every kindness you do quietly, every time you carry someone's worst day and let them keep their dignity and ask for nothing back, goes up on a wall you cannot see into an account that does not appear on any statement. And most of us spend our whole lives like Calvin, never understanding that the wall is anything more than a nice memory, never realizing we are in the only way that finally matters, wealthy beyond measure. And then a dark night comes, a kitchen table, an impossible number, and the wall pays out, and we discover that we were rich the entire time. So keep building it. Carry the people in front of you. Ask for nothing, not because it will come back to you, though this story suggests it might, but because building that wall is the richest thing a human being can do with a life. And the payout, when it comes, is only ever the proof of a wealth you already had. If this story reached you, tell me in the comments about a time someone carried your worst day and asked for nothing, because that person is on a wall somewhere in an account you cannot see, and they deserve to be named out loud tonight. And subscribe, because this channel is a wall of exactly these people, the quiet ones, the ones who give and never count, the ones who find out only at the very end just how much they were worth all along. And there is another one going up right now. Come and help me pin it up. And this week, do one thing for me. Carry somebody's worst day quietly and ask for nothing and tell no one, not for the payout, for the wall. Start building yours. You are going to be so much richer than you know, and one dark night when you least expect it and most need it, you are going to find out exactly how much. There's always room on the wall.